ReZero, Side Story, The Awkward Duo Part 1.
Natsuki Subaru had practically no experience with walking around the neighborhood alongside someone of the opposite sex. The last woman he'd walked around holding hands with had been his mother. He would need to go back to when he was a primary school student to find a time where he'd had rapport with the opposite sex, outside of relatives. Considering that he had to go all the way back to when there was no distinction between male and female to find any memories of that spoke volumes about his relationships. Subaru, even so, this business of trying to find that girl among this crowd is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Subaru kept making talk with the girl walking right next to him, unable to stand the awkward silence. He wouldn't have known how to pass the time otherwise. The girl, I guess you're right. But it's not like we can just give up. If we have to find a needle, then a needle we must find. Though I really only have myself to blame for letting my guard down. The girl who'd given him that reply was so beautiful that he felt like his eyes were about to explode. She had snowy white skin and long silver hair that shimmered like moonlight. Her white garb greatly accentuated her innocence, and her amethyst eyes were full of determination as they gazed off ahead. Her picturesque beauty stood out even from Subaru's shortish life. And to make matters worse, he could hardly get to grips with himself in the fact that she matched his tastes to a T. Regardless though, that wasn't the only reason why Subaru was walking with her. Subaru, either way, I owe you for helping me out, so I'm gonna give it my all for you, my young lady. The girl, I already told you that you don't need to do any of this. You sure are an odd boy. Though the girl stubbornly refused to admit it, the fact was, she'd saved his life. He really didn't need any more reason than that to help her. Subaru, well, even so, walking up ahead of the girl, he strutted down the narrow alley at rapid pace. Then, he stopped in his tracks, turned around and struck his usual pose as she tilted her head in doubt. Subaru, by the way, it feels like we're going somewhere with less people around. Are you sure it's this way? The girl, wasn't it you who knew the way? It felt like great troubles awaited them ahead, yet this strange duo's trek was already going awry.
ReZero, Side Story, The Awkward Duo Part 2.
The girl had practically no experience with walking around the neighborhood alongside someone of the opposite sex. Or rather, she could hardly remember spending time with someone like this. Are you a little nervous perhaps? A voice suddenly came whispering in her ear, causing a slight smile to creep onto her face. The girl, just a little. But now's not the time to worry about such things. She purposely stiffened her lips as she replied back to the voice in something like a whisper. Though it wasn't like they were actually speaking, they were using something like thought waves to communicate, a kind of magic that utilized the path between a contracted spirit and its contractor to share their thoughts. The young man next to them heard nothing of their current conversation as he went around in circles in search for someone to call out to. He was a strange young man. She hadn't taken notice of this when she'd first come across him cornered by those thugs, but he was dressed weirdly. And he had unusual black hair and dark eyes, plus, once in a while, he'd say stuff in a strange language that she'd never heard before. He was probably a foreigner, but even so, there was a lot of odd stuff about him. He was strangely prudent for his confidence, and seemed to know a lot despite lacking in common sense. Even the girl could tell that something wasn't quite right, in spite of believing she couldn't speak for others. But it's definitely thanks to Subaru that we were able to get closer to our objective. You have to give him credit for that. Don't you think he'd be delighted if you gave him some praise? The girl, quit with the silly talk. I doubt he'd be delighted even if I said something to him. The tone of his voice sounded pleasant, in contrast to hers which showed signs of discouragement, probably because she understood where she stood. Nevertheless, but that boy gave off the impression that he didn't care about stuff like your identity, didn't he? I don't know what you think about that though, Satella-san. There was a small hint of blame there in his words, which the girl accepted, along with the pang of conscience that came with it. Her cheeks still flushed whenever she recalled how the black-haired boy, who'd called himself Natsuki Subaru, had effortlessly accepted her confessing to being a half-elf. There'd probably never been a moment in the girl's life where shame had filled her heart as much as it did now. Subaru's reaction back then had been completely unexpected for her. It had made her aware of just how shallow and conceitful she was, bringing her almost to the verge of tears, and what really couldn't serve as her saving grace was her own heart for being so happy about it. Satella, maybe I'm just a really bad person. Subaru, Did you say something? Satella, no, nothing. Let's just hurry and search the slums. Flustered, the girl tried to pass off for the fact that she'd let that slip out loud, rather than as a thought wave. She pushed the young man forward as he tilted his head in confusion. They'd helped a lost child out, and thanks to that, they'd been able to get a strong lead from its mother, who'd told them about the slums, where stolen goods end up. How could she even reward this young man after he'd led her this far? Having completely forgotten that she'd saved his life when they'd first met, the girl continued to fret, not realizing that they were even with each other.
ReZero, Side Story, The Awkward Duo Part 3.
Seeing that the girl named Satella was getting more and more discouraged, Subaru began to question in dismay whether he'd screwed up by acting as her escort. Her objective, which was searching for the insignia, seemed to be going well so far. They still hadn't found the item in question, but he did feel like they were making good progress in tracking it down. There was no question that looking for the lost child had given them valuable information and blown a wind in their sails. Even so, ever since they'd started searching the slums, Satella had been acting strangely, sighing and such every time she glanced his way. Subaru, it sure is damaging when someone looks at your face and sighs at it. And if that isn't painful enough already, it becomes 4 times as effective when a beautiful girl does it. Anyone snubbed by such a beautiful girl would have been hit just as hard, such was the fearsomeness of this special attack. The fact that this girl wasn't satisfied didn't match with all the life experience he'd accumulated so far. Now if that isn't a bitter pill to swallow, he mused. Subaru, though, well, I don't really have any life experience to match with this sort of thing. That's why he was making great efforts, using his liveliness, to try and cover up for his lack of experience. Yet so far, all of the topics, quips and American jokes he'd brought up had fallen flat. Then, all that he had left was to reward her with actual results, thus he decided he would go back to his original plan, and show her the fruits of his hard work. Subaru didn't realize that acting like that was only making the girl more and more discouraged. Subaru, I have to let her see my cool side by showing her some results. I need to take advantage of this windfall. People's general attitudes towards Subaru asking them questions had improved a lot since they'd come to the slums. Strange as it was, most people in the main streets hadn't even bothered to give them a moment of their time, whereas, in the back streets, they'd gotten far more welcoming responses. Even now, Subaru was still holding some kind of dried fruit an old woman had given him while saying, "Here, eat this and live strong." He didn't feel courageous enough to put it in his mouth, but all the same, her consideration was well received. Subaru, guess I'll just feed it to Puck or something. Come here kitty kitty, chchchchchch. Satella, please don't give him anything strange, it'd be a real pain if he were to get a taste for it. Puck, if you think that I'm going to fall for these cheap tricks that only work when feeding strays, then you're sorely mistaken. The grey kitten pushed its way out from Satella's silver hair and emerged onto her shoulder. Apparently he was supposed to be a great being known as a spirit, but Subaru saw him as no more than a cat, albeit a rather peculiar one. Satella's response had also felt more like something you'd say to a pet than a spirit. Subaru, the way you're saying it, you sound to me like a character flag where you've been completely hooked in. Puck, HMMPH. You can only say these things to me now. Just you wait until I unleash my true strength, you shall regret all of your careless remarks. Meow meow meow. Yet halfway through his grand speech, he flicked the tip of the spirit's, Puck's, nose with a few blades of grass he'd twisted together. As soon as he did, the spirit began to swipe his paws at it, acting very much like a cat. Indeed he was all bark and no bite. Subaru, you sure are damn good at raising and triggering flags. Puck, it pains me to admit it, but I really can't resist playing with it. Puck's face had turned positively cat-like as he played, now completely under Subaru's spell. As she watched them, Satella couldn't help but burst out into a few small chuckles. Subaru saw her reaction, and with that, one of his missions had been cleared, one that he'd been pouring the same amount of enthusiasm into as their search for the insignia. He raised his thumb up, eliciting a discreet nod from Puck. She looked far better with a smile on her face. At least that was something which both Subaru and the spirit were in agreement with.
ReZero, Side Story, The Awkward Duo Part 4.
Satella, no. It's nothing. I'll give him a proper apology when I get my insignia back. Puck, I don't know what you're trying to apologize for. It'd be nicer to give him a thank you rather than a sorry. And if that gets you smiling some more, then that'd be fantastic. Satella, you dummy. Subaru had stepped into the loot house, all the while putting on a show of bravado. The girl had sent him off, grateful from the bottom of her heart. She had so much to tell him when he came back after fulfilling their goal. Satella, though. I'm way more of a dummy than you. The girl was standing watch outside just like the young man had asked her to. She quietly brought her hand over to the pendant she wore over her chest. It was inlaid with a bright green crystal, and within it slumbered the spirit that she relied on more than anyone else in this world. She'd ended up keeping both him and Subaru around her for too long today. Perhaps Puck wouldn't be able to forgive her, no matter how much she apologized, especially for how dishonest she'd ended up being with Subaru. Though apologizing would be the thoughtful thing to do, her very idea of it was shallow. At least for now, all she could do was pray that no harm would befall that goofy young man. Satella? And yet, her prayer was interrupted by the sound of a sudden crash. She snapped her head up and ran into the loot house, her amethyst eyes vigilant. The loot house was a large, old, single-story building located deep inside the slums. Only a few minutes had passed since she'd sent Subaru out into the pitch black awaiting him behind its enormous closed doors. Satella, Subaru, the girl stepped inside without any hesitation, still keeping her guard up. She kept herself focused, and made sure that the minute spirits drifting around her were ready to kick into action at a moment's notice. Then, she squinted her eyes through the darkness, when suddenly, she spotted a white glow coming from something that had fallen in a corner of the room. It was coming from the light source, the lagmite ore, that she'd given Subaru. Satella? She hesitated for a moment, wondering whether she should walk over to it. However, it was at that moment that the decision was made for her. The girl felt something whistling towards her. She immediately turned around, giving her minute spirits a command, but before they could carry out her order, her body was ravaged by a sharp blade. The blow pierced through her and she clattered down onto the hard floor, unable to do anything about it. She could feel a terrible cold gripping her, far more pronounced it was than the scorching heat. Yet, it was only for a moment that she could feel them. Satella, countless thoughts, feelings, resolutions, memories and decisions flashed through her mind. It was as if they were a muddy stream, sweeping away all of her fears and regrets. In the hour of her death, the girl realized that she'd become completely empty. She hadn't found out anything. She hadn't realized anything. Things were just ending without beginning. Yet it was in that moment, just you wait, she could hear a voice. A voice that seemed to be almost fading, a voice full of anguish and regret, a voice that, like hers, was on the brink of death. It was nearing its last, yet still unwilling to admit defeat. But then, why is it that I will definitely, why is it that I want to believe in the words that would follow? The story, however, ends here for now. The girl's thoughts unrewarded, the young man's unheard. Even so, the story wins back and starts anew. Perhaps, only then, would the time they'd spent together be rewarded.